We are indeed very grateful that Professor Amartya Sen has arrived, and Professor Partha Chatterjee has kindly consented to preside over the program. May I request everyone to please maintain silence and turn off their mobile phones. There's just a very small formal welcome for Professor Sen and Professor Chatterjee. So I'd request our registrar, Dr. Snehomanju Boshu, to please give them their flowers, the Uttoriya, and the gifts that we are giving to them from Jadavpur University. The As you can see, we have had a huge unexpected turnout for this event. I would also request Professor Shuranjan Dar. See, everybody is getting lost in the crowd. Shuranjan Da, apni kothay? So, formal handover hoye gele if you just say a few words. Please maintain silence. একটু শান্ত থাকুন প্লিজ মোবাইল ফোনগুলো একটু সুইচ অফ করলে ভালো হয় উইদাউট ফার্দার অ্যাডু আই রিকোয়েস্ট our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Shuranjan Das, to welcome our guests.
Respected Professor Sen, respected Professor Chatterjee, distinguished members of the House, which includes colleagues from this university, colleagues from other universities, colleagues from other centers of higher learning, members of diplomatic missions, other sections of the civil society, and I'm very happy to find our former Vice Chancellor Professor Ghosh is also here, and of course my very dear students. Could I, on my own personal behalf and on behalf of the university, sincerely and warmly welcome you to this lecture session. We remain grateful to Professor Amartya Sen for kindly agreeing to be with us today. Sir, we welcome you in a particular context. The context being, if I am not totally wrong, you started your teaching career in Jadavpur University, and you also founded the economics department of this university. And sir, you will be happy to know that the economics department which you had founded has recently been recognized by the government of India as a nodal center for the study of economics amongst all state universities of the country. We also welcome among us Professor Partha Chatterjee, and we thank him for kindly agreeing to preside over the session and moderate the discussions which should follow after Professor Sen's lecture. For me, it's a personal privilege to welcome Professor Chatterjee, whom we know as Parthoda, because Parthoda might remember, I belong to the second batch of his students in Presidency College. We are certainly looking forward to a very stimulating discussion on a city with which most of us present here are intrinsically connected. I remember when the third centenary of this city was being celebrated, my esteemed teacher in Presidency College and now my esteemed colleague in this university, Professor Shukanto Choudhury, had edited 2 volumes on various aspects of Calcutta, which he aptly entitled as a living city. Of course, our city continues to be a living city, but surely the experience of this living has been changing. The contours of the living has changed, and we look forward to have glimpses of these changes today. But is it true, as is often alleged in the press, that Calcutta is becoming less living today? Is it true that Calcutta is becoming much less eclectic, much less cosmopolitan, and much less tolerant? I am sure the House will agree that the coffee house in College Street remains in our memory as an important site of intellectual engagement. As students of Presidency College, and I have my near contemporary for the Shugata Bose, he was 2 years junior to me. I also have Professor Jayanta Sengupta, who also was much junior in Presidency College. But we all remember how we used to discuss intrinsic issues of history and politics over cups of coffee in College Street with such illustrious teachers as Professor Oshin Das Gupta, Professor Hiren Chakraborty, Professor Rajat Ray, Professor Omio Bakchi, Professor Deepak Banerjee, to name a few. Even as a young member of the Calcutta University teaching fraternity, I remember having spent fruitful hours of intellectual engagement in coffee house with our senior colleagues. It was often the case that the table in which we were sitting in the coffee house, in the next table, there would be animated discussions between the then important cultural figures of the time, like Gaur Kishore Ghosh, Shakti Chaudhuri, Shakti Chatterjee, Sunil Gangopadhyay, amongst others. Is this intellectual ambience still present in coffee house today? If it is not, there is a serious problem of the living city to which we had been exposed. But we do look forward to having reflections on such issues today. But I do believe that Jadavpur University, with its strong cultural legacy, can play a leading role in keeping alive the intellectual dynamism of the city, as is evident from the tremendous response that we have received to this lecture session. And by doing that, Jadavpur University hopes to fulfill the hope that Kobiguru Rabindranath Tagore had reposed on 14th August 1906 on the Bengal National College, the precursor of the present Jadavpur University. And I quote from him, অনেকদিন পরে আজ বাঙালি যথার্থভাবে একটা কিছু পাইল, আমরা নিজের সত্যকে পাইলাম, নিজের শক্তিকে পাইলাম। তোমরা যদি এই বিদ্যা ভবনের জন্য গৌরব অনুভব করো, তবেই ইহার গৌরব বৃদ্ধি হইবে। Unquote. As I conclude, let me put on record our sincere thanks for my distinguished colleague, Professor Samantak Das, because without his initiative, it would not have been possible to organize this particular session. On behalf of the university, I stand here to affirm all possible administrative help if such academic endeavors are organized in future, academic endeavors like this, which would be able to provide a platform to bring together members of the university community cutting across disciplines to discuss intrinsic and important issues relating not only to academics but also to issues of nation building. With these words, could I once again sincerely and warmly thank you for being with us today, and take this opportunity of welcoming you to what I am sure will be a very fruitful and illuminating lecture session. Thank you very much indeed.
I request Professor Partho Chatterjee to kindly conduct the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a very pleasant and simple task, which is to get the proceedings underway. I will not waste everybody's time by trying to introduce Professor Amartya Sen, his eminence, and the enormous love that all of us have for him is shown by the incredible enthusiasm, especially of the students of this campus. So there is really no point trying to introduce him. I just have two very brief comments to make at the beginning of Professor Sen's talk. First, to reiterate what Suranjan Das said, the significance of this venue for this talk. I gather Professor Sen is now writing his memoirs, and what he will speak about today will be this city, his memories of this city in the initial years after independence. It was at this campus that he began his extremely distinguished career as a teacher of economics in 1956, I believe. Uh, and so we will hear from him from that time. And I'm sure most of the audience here probably was not even born then. The second minor point is that although Professor Shen is probably the most distinguished economist in this country, please do not ask him any questions about the union budget. Save that for another occasion. He has agreed to answer questions on his talk, and we will have plenty of time after he is finished. So, with that, please, I welcome Professor Shen, and we are eagerly waiting for his talk.
Am I heard at this moment? Yeah. Okay. So shall I start? Stop me by raising two hands if, if I become inaudible. So first of all, aside from expressing my total delight in being back at Jadavpur, um, my gratefulness to Pastor for chairing this session, to my appreciation of the Vice Chancellor's very kind remarks, um, and of course my appreciation of all of you being here and coming here. Uh, I've always taken some pride of being closely associated with my students, and so nothing is ever as pleasing to me as seeing a sight of a large number of students in a gathering. It was on a monsoon-drenched day in Kolkata in July 1951 that I registered in Presidency College to do economics and mathematics, going to College Street in Calcutta. I came from being schooled in Shantiniketan and had originally planned to do physics and mathematics in Calcutta. In fact, I'd written to Presidency College applying to do that. In changing my field, I was partly influenced by my growing political interest and involvement, but I was already harboring the obstinate idea of working for a different kind of India, not as poor, as iniquitous, as unjust as the country around me. Demands of social change clearly called for, I could not escape the thought, some understanding of economics. My decision to move to economics was also influenced by my discussions with Professor Amartya Sen, a great economist and a close friend of the family. He was something like an uncle to me. My decision was consolidated further through my personal friendship with Sukumar Chakravarti, who was already studying in Presidency College, doing what was then called intermediate arts, while I was doing intermediate science in Shantiniketan. To say that Sukumar was brilliant would be a gigantic understatement. He was clever in a breathtaking way, extremely sharp in his analytical reasoning, and astoundingly well informed on almost any subject. Sukumar, like me, was interested in politics with rather similar left-wing inclinations. He had chosen economics because he told me of his deep involvement in politics and his particular interest in Marxian thinking. The world around us was absolutely unacceptable, Sukumai argued. In this judgment, he did not receive any resistance from me at all. Sukumai used to visit me in Santiniketan. He first came there to see, I think, Mukul Dey's painting, and I showed him around, and then he came quite frequently, and I flatter myself in thinking he came mainly to chat with me. And the idea of my joining him in presidency doing economics and mathematics developed gradually but quite firmly. When I arrived in Presidency College, I spotted Sukhumai at the top of the central staircase, a prominent feature of the college building, taking us upstairs to where our classes were mostly held. The staircase was famous already for historical reasons, including for it being the venue where Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, in his own student days, had allegedly sternly lectured the principal of the college on the evils of the British Empire, along with indulging in what was described as some rough handling. There's some uncertainty on this matter as to whether it did occur or not. Sukhumai came promptly down the staircase and joined me and wanted to show me around. I felt very comfortable about being in Presidency College and about doing economics and, of course, about Sukhumai's presence. Sukhumai insisted that we go to the famous coffee house, which came up in the Vice Chancellor's statement, across the street for catching up with each other. The coffee house was a workers' cooperative, which would be later on taken over by the Indian Coffee Board, but which I believe is now back to being a cooperative again. I have to check that one. It was an amazing place for enjoyable conversation as well as serious learning from prolonged discussions. I remember hundreds of arguments there on politics, which provided many of the central themes for our arguments. In general, I cannot describe adequately how greatly I, in particular, felt I was learning from being there and learning from my fellow students who were telling me what they had read or had found out in some other way, including from lectures they had attended in various subjects, from history and economics to anthropology, biology, and physics, in one place or another. More than direct transmission of snippets of knowledge, there was the remarkable impact of closely knit arguments disputing each other's understanding and convictions, varying convictions. Topan Raichoudhury, the historian, who was a student some years before me, exaggerated a little, but only a little, not really a lot, when he wrote, referring to conversations in the coffee house. I quote from Topanda: some of us got all our education from our fellow students in the seat of in that seat of learning, the coffee house, without ever bothering to cross the street to attend classes in the other institution, that's Presidency College, by the way, unquote. The coffee house got its clientele not just from Presidency, but also from Calcutta University, large part of which was located in College Street and nearby colleges, including the Medical College, the Scottish Church College, the Sanskrit College, Central Calcutta College, previously called Islamia College and later on further renamed as Maulana Azad College, among others. In between Presidency and the coffee house, there was the college street, around which, or in the vicinity of which, most of these academic institutions were located. The numerous bookshops that dotted the coffee house corner of the college street, sometimes called the college square, provided another source of enjoyment as well as education. My favorite was a bookshop called Dasgupta, which I used as a kind of library. Mr. Dasgupta, the proprietor, was remarkably tolerant of us, reading books without buying them, standing or sitting on his stool in his bookshop. He sometimes even allowed Sukuma and me to borrow a book to take home for one night on condition that we do not soil it in any way. He would often wrap the covers of the book in newspaper foldings. He knew that we would typically not buy books, but only read them, borrowing from his bookshop. When a friend of mine who was giving me company in the bookshop asked him, I quote him, "Do you not mind that Amartya cannot afford to buy many books?" To which Mr. Dasgupta replied, "Why do you think I sell books? Rather, they are making much more money selling jewelry." Part of the student community of Presidency College was politically quite active, though I could not develop myself enough enthusiasm for any political party to join it. The quality of sympathy and egalitarian commitment of the left appealed to me greatly. That was in itself a factor of importance. It also appealed to many of my friends and fellow students. I think not only of Sukumoy, but Pacho Gupta, another historian, Varun Dey, uh, Binoy Chaudhary, a great many others. Uh, so it appealed to many of my friends and fellow students in that oddly elitist college, the kind of rudimentary thinking that had got me inspired while I was finishing my school years in Santiniketan to run regular evening schools, as I did, for illiterate rural children in the neighboring, mostly Sautal villages, now seemed to me to be badly in need of systematic broadening and social and political enlargement. Many of the politically interested fellow students with whom I spent time were, like me, involved with the Student Federation on the left of politics, but did not join the Communist Party. Some did, but many of them didn't. I found the idea of party discipline with a fixed set of hardened beliefs quite off-putting. And yet the egalitarian, and I emphasize particularly in these days, egalitarian and secular commitments of the left offered something at our time. I believe things may have slipped a little at the present moment. That is a matter on which I would seek enlightenment, which no other student political group could match. Calcutta itself, despite its immensely rich intellectual and cultural life, provided many constant reminders of the proximity of unbearable economic misery, and not even an elite college could ignore its continuous and close presence. I felt naturally aligned to the left segment or the student body, but at the same time resented its dogmatism, including the recurrent vilification at that time of parliamentary democracy as bourgeois democracy by the left orthodoxy based on what seemed to me to be ill-informed reasoning. That mixed heritage did not prevent many of us from joining the Student Federation, which I did, and being quite influential in it. I believe I'm right in saying that it was when I was leading, I had a leading role in the Student Federation during 1952-53, that leftist student body, for the first time, won some elections in the Presidency College Students' Union. But with that little display, which I've just done, of pride and self-centered folly, I must now move on with the story, since I have promised to cover a fair amount of ground in this lecture and also leave time for discussion, both from Pastor and from you, the public and the listeners here. In 1953, after doing my 2 years in Presidency College, I went off to Cambridge to study and finished my undergraduate studies there 2 years later in June 1955. I was then registered to do a PhD in Cambridge, but with luck which came my way, rather than I emphasize any special talent, I obtained a few good research results quite rapidly, which seemed to attract attention in the academia, and the papers presenting them got uh, readily accepted for publication in some leading economic journals. By then, I was in the odd position of having completed my PhD work with what I was told was a respectable dissertation at the end of my first year. But I was disallowed by Cambridge University to submit my thesis for a PhD. To earn the right to submit, you had to let 3 years go by, and I was in deficit of 2 years. On top of that very frustrating situation, since I felt I'd finished the work and didn't want to work on that anymore, I was also badly missing Calcutta and its intellectual life. So I went off to Calcutta for a planned period of 2 years to become eligible to submit my already completed thesis, allowing my completed dissertation to mature like wine matures with the mere passage of time. And I made the promise to Cambridge that I would work diligently towards applying my theory uh, to Indian data. That was the reasoning. This is the background to my association with Jadavpur. This was the time that Jadavpur University, where I'm lecturing today, came into my life. What was a distinguished engineering college was then being converted into a full university. This was coincidentally just the time when I returned to Calcutta, and I was both surprised and a little bewildered when I received a letter from the Vice Chancellor of Jadavpur offering me a job and a request to help it to initiate its economics department. It was a scary challenge. I was just completing 23 and did not fancy being a professor and the head of the department. But since I was also boring many people in presidency and also in Cambridge by lecturing to them constantly on how a new curriculum in economics ought to be set up, I could not find a decent enough reason to run away. So after some hesitation, I joined up and found myself working hard in a rainy August on making syllabuses for the economics courses to be taught at Jadavpur, as well as trying to recruit people to join me in teaching there. Eventually, I did recruit 7 more people. Given the staff shortage to start with when we were doing the recruiting, I remember having to give for some months 28 lectures per week in different areas in economics in the early days of the department coming into being. Since I now give one lecture a week for my job, 28 does seem like a large number. This was really exhausting, but also challenging, and in fact a lot of fun, as I was learning many new things in different parts of economics through my efforts to give lectures on them for my students, and to start with, building up a decent curriculum. The teaching experience was marvelously educational for me. In addition to being of some use, I hope, to my students. In fact, I also decided, and this was the understanding that came to me here, but has lived with me forever, decided that we cannot really be sure of knowing a subject well until we have tried to lecture on it to others. Given my youthful age and the widespread rumor that I had got the job at Jadavpur University through nepotism and influence by knowing the right people rather than merit, there was a predictable and entirely understandable storm of protest. On top of that, there was ground for political suspicion in the known fact that I had left wing convictions, the days of my having been active in student politics, in student federation, in presidency college, were only 3 years earlier. Among the sharpest attacks was one that came from a very right-wing political magazine which was a big seller called Giovanni, which seemed to fear that thanks to my appointment, the end of the world had become immensely more imminent. These were not pleasant things to read, but I had fun with a skillfully drawing cartoon which I kept for quite some time, showing that I was being snatched from a cradle to be to be immediately made into a professor in front of a blackboard. What sustained me was the enthusiasm of my students, for which I was tremendously grateful. I had some really brilliant students, like Shorin Bhattacharya, who would go on to become a very distinguished academic and a writer. In fact, the students who had dared to join this totally new university and totally new course were in general very talented. I kept in touch with my former students for many years after I left Jadavpur, and they often got together themselves. Shorin's wife Reva was also an excellent student of mine from the first class. I enjoyed the opportunity and the challenge of Jadavpur, which was quite an exciting place intellectually, having been a very distinguished engineering college for many decades. With the exception of me, all the other new professorial appointees heading different departments in Jadavpur, one professor per department, were well established and distinguished. They were also much older than me. The chair of the Department of History was Professor Sushavan Sarkar, who had been earlier on Professor of History in Presidency College when I was studying economics there. A superb teacher and a great researcher, Professor Sarkar had a big influence on my thinking when I was a student. I attended his lectures regularly, breaking the departmental boundaries in President's College. It was a fantastic privilege for me to be Sushovan Babu's colleague, and thanks to his affection for me, I have to say very gratefully, deep affection, I also got regular advice from him on what I should and particularly should not do at Jadavpur as a new and unacceptably young professor. The chair of the Department of Comparative Literature was occupied by Buddhadev Bose, well known to you all, I'm sure, as a leading Bengali writer, with a formidable reputation in poetry as well as in innovative Bengali prose. I was a great admirer of his work, but also I knew him personally since he was the father of my college friend, Meenakshi, popularly known as Mimi, who and her husband Jyotirmoy Dotto were close friends of mine at presidency. The head of the Bengali department was Sushil Dey, a very well respected and I believe a really extraordinarily scholarly researcher. Both Sushil Dey and Buddhadev Bose had taught earlier in Dhaka University and were colleagues of my father who taught chemistry in Dhaka University. More alarmingly, Sushil Dey also knew my paternal grandfather well. He would sometimes press the point that he was senior to me by more than 40 years when he had any disagreement on a matter of university policy, which I fear happened often enough because they were quite conservative on university matters. He would supplement his reasoned argument, and they were good arguments, disputing my proposal and dismissing them by invoking my family tree, leaving me rather helpless. I quote, "Your grandfather, who was such a wise man, and whom I knew so very well, would see the point you are missing without any problem at all." Such a remark in the academic council could be quite discouraging. I should record that Professor Day won all the arguments he had with me. In the faculty, we also had a remarkably innovative historian, Ranajit Guha, who later initiated the subaltern studies, a highly influential school of colonial and post-colonial history, strongly influenced by Marxian thinking, which is sometimes others don't recognize, but taking quite a different turn from the standard Marxian route. I called him Ranjita, since he was a few years older than me, though still quite young. We did a number of things together, including going to the uh, meeting of the very big Kishan Sabha in one gown, by one of the few attempts at attending mass political rally. When I ran into Ranjita for the first time, shortly after classes began in the Jadavpur campus, I was delighted, since I knew about him and his uncanny originality of thought. We, in fact, had some common friends. When we met, Ranjita said, "You're very famous, for I have been constantly hearing about your shortcomings from everyone and about the mistake made by the university in appointing you." To speak in Bengali, চতুর্দিকে আপনার খুব নিন্দে শুনছি। আপনি ভীষণ প্রসিদ্ধ লোক। He continued, "Let's get together straight away. In fact, let's have dinner tonight." I went to his apartment in Ponditia Road that evening, which soon became one of my regular haunts. I was there 3 or 4 times a week. Ranjit had earlier on experienced a very engaging life as an active communist, but by the time I met him, he had decided that this had been a big folly. We were not in 100% agreement on that. He still remained a revolutionary in a quiet and non-violent way, working for the neglected underdogs of society. But he had completely lost faith in communist organization, not to mention Stalinism, which was very much in vogue in Calcutta then. Ranjita was then married to Martha, who was of Polish origin and had who had Jewish ancestry, and together they hosted gatherings of their friends, including me, which on innumerable occasions for tea with delicious accompaniment, along with lively chatting with no predetermined agenda. Excuse me, let me get some water. Rajita was in the process at that time of writing his first book, A Rule of Property for Bengal, the monograph that would establish him as a historian of great distinction and also as an intellectual of unusual imagination and vision. It got widely um, noticed and praised uh, across the world and was printed a number of times. In the Princeton University Press edition of the book, I had the privilege of writing the introduction to that book. The book investigates the intellectual background of Lord Cornwallis's deadly permanent settlement imposed on Bengal in 1793, which did extraordinary harm to the economy. To explain why, and briefly, why this harm, mainly because, as an economist would see it, through removing nearly all incentives for improving the performance of agriculture and also through freezing land ownership based inequalities which became very large in Bengal. The rule of property was a work of quite profound originality, differing from standard works on British colonial policy in India, focusing as it did on the role of ideas as opposed to greed and self-interest, which had become the mainstay of critical history at the time. Gandhi was offering a different vision. The focus on the underlying rationale of permanent settlement and on the reasons and humane ideas that led to it is all the more striking because in the event, the permanent settlement produced by these humane ideas produced quite a disastrous result. Guha's focus, quite unusually for colonial history, was not on imperial exploitation and the dominance of British interests over the concerns of the subject. Rather, his focus was on various well-meaning thoughts that inspired alternative proposals for land settlement in Bengal and also led to their botched up applications, leading ultimately to Cornwallis's terrible rule of property for Bengal. The rule of property for Bengal is not, however, the work for which Ranjit Goa is now most famous. That distinction goes to the series of subaltern studies initiated and led by him, the first volume of which was published in 1982 with the paper by you, I believe. Subaltern studies are much more ambitious than his first book, and they comprehensively disputed elitist interpretations of history. In those studies, Goha was deeply critical of the fact that the historiography of Indian nationalism had been, for a long time, dominated by elitism, by both colonial elitism and national elitism, elitism. You could even say bourgeois nationalist elitism, which Rangita did much to disestablish. This was a big move to liberate the writing of Indian history, and by implication history in general, from its debilitating concentration on elitist achievements. While I was enjoying my work and the interactions with my students in Jadavpur, I continued to have regular visits to College Street and, of course, the old coffee house. I had left presidency in 1953, well before 1956, when the misdeeds of Stalin's Soviet Union would be placed in bright light in the world, light in the world by Khrushchev in the 20th Party Congress. But even in the 1940s, I must say, I found it hard to believe that any discerning reader uh, could think that the purges and the trials that the USSR had in the 1930s could be anything but organized implantation of alleged guilt. It was based on making people confess to be dealt with by the heaviest of punishment. I had been having read a lot of Bukharin earlier. It was interesting for me to see that this foremost Leninist of this period was seen as confessing that he had been trying to subvert the Soviet Union. And even when American visitors like John Gunther said so, I simply didn't believe it. These issues came up in discussions in the coffee house when I was a student at Presidency, and I sometimes found myself feeling rather deserted by most of my friends. Between the righteous who thought Marx got it all wrong, a hugely mistaken diagnosis, and true leftists, quote unquote, who thought there was no tyranny in Russia, only the operation of, quote, the democratic will of the people, a belief of unfathomable naivety, it appeared to me. We had a very difficult passage. I began thinking on the need for me to be less dependent on others, on getting agreement of others, pleasing as it would be. But that is not a good way of thinking about politics. And perhaps in our discussion time, we can take up that question. Which, that is, politics, must involve groups, but make room for individual thought and critical, possibly heretical reasoning. One reason why I was so impressed with Ranjita, since I was pretty well informed that the readings that he had done, mainly on Marxian classics, was his ability to disagree. That combination of social existence and individual reasoning has always been important to me, and my experience of arguments in Calcutta in the 1950s, first at College Street near Presidency College, and then at Jadavpur, persistently brought out the need for that combination. As it happens, my first book, and if anyone would like to ask me, I believe in some ways perhaps the book I would mostly associate myself with, on social choice, collective choice and social welfare, published in 1970, began on page one with a statement from Karl Marx from the Economic and Philosophic Manuscript of 1844. I quote myself quoting Marx in that um, manuscript, 1844. What is to be avoided above all is the re-establishing of society as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual, unquote. Not the society being important in any way other than being a constitutive feature of individual and an individual being a constitutive part of, of society. That thought is important today, I believe, and we may have time to discuss, in resisting under-reasoned recharacterization of Bengali society in terms of narrow-minded religiosity. It was similarly relevant in the 1950s when human deprivation in economic as well as political life demanded a huge political departure, which was slow in coming in the 1950s. It would eventually come, but didn't come then. Well, time to wind up. 1951, when I came to study and live in Calcutta, was still quite close to India's independence. The great tragedies of British rule, particularly prominently in its last years, greatly influenced our thinking on the kind of change we wanted to have in India. Two calamities in particular were, I thought, extremely important and hard to escape, and I would comment on each briefly. There was, of course, grinding poverty, which affected the lives of most people in India, but which from time to time exploded into big famines, with huge mortality from starvation and related deprivation. I had watched personally the Bengal famine of 1953, in which between 2 and 3 million people died. When the British Empire, it's interesting to remember, when the British Empire started in the 18th century, Adam Smith in particular, but also a number of his contemporaries, including Condorcet, and many other leading European economists, described India, and Bengal in particular, as a relatively prosperous country. Adam Smith even discusses why was Bengal so prosperous, and since he never wanted to tell between people being diligent here but not diligent elsewhere, it was very much from Samuel Huntington in that respect. He put it down to the fact of Bengal's rivers contributed to the prosperity in a way that dry parts of Africa didn't succeed. Not so much that Africans fought, but the early premise of Bengal was very prosperous. But by the time the empire ended, India had become one of the largest illustrations of poverty in the world. The need for rapid economic progress in India was hard not to see. Along with widespread economic poverty, there was also massive illiteracy in India. This was not, of course, new in the pre-modern world, in the 18th century, for example, but while the world was making dramatic progress in school education, first in Europe and in America, then in Japan and elsewhere, India's literacy rate was barely above 10% as the British left the country. Rabindranath Tagore saw in this massive lack of education India's biggest handicap, holding India back in every field. I was completely convinced by Rabindranath's reasoning, but in arguments in the coffee house, I was, I must confess, somewhat surprised to see considerable resistance to that point of view, not to the need for more income, but to the need for more education. The Communist Party in particular, which had a tremendously good record in Kerala, and this reflects in Bengal, does not have a similarly good record. In tackling this problem, there have been mixed successes. The land reform worked extremely well in West Bengal, and here the left must get credit. But the destruction of industries, fed by various causes, first of all, by industrial action without looking at a better way of having a better deal for workers, all tended to relate to unreasoned pursuit of policies that replace constructive thinking by taking joy in obstruction and obduracy. We can come back to that later, but I now move to the second calamity, which uh, also was very big, immediate, and complicated. While the evidence of cooperation across religiously dividing lines in India, and I emphasize this, cooperation across religious dividing lines. I don't mean tolerance only. It is cooperation, doing things together. While the evidence of cooperation exhausts religious dividing lines in India, what my grandfather, if I may quote a member of the family, Kittimon Sen saw as Hindu Musalman Jukto Sadhana was widespread across India, including Bengal. In the decade preceding India's independence, there were huge outbursts of communal violence, particularly between Hindus and Muslims. The broad identity of Indian related to nationality, language, location, belief, and a hundred other features from earlier days had been crushed by political obstinacy into a sharp division related to religion, particularly by created hostility between groups of Hindus and Muslims. When I visited Calcutta, I could hear cries for help through the night of Hindus and Muslims under attack, facing murder of themselves, in fact, genocide. That was the nature of both Hindu politics and Muslim politics as the country became independent and partitioned. Calcutta was still recovering from it. A few years later, when I came to the city to live in 1951, with well-known sites of recent killing known to all, like Kolkata, and there were similar things in Bangladesh. But while Calcutta was recovering, so was Bangladesh, and no less quickly. In the 1950s, we buried the old ghost, East Pakistan. This was, I believe, a gigantic achievement, given what India was like in the last few years of the 1940s. East Pakistan was preoccupied with language movement, not a division between Hindus and Muslims, but Bengali speakers and others particularly in Pakistan, ruling over East Pakistan at that time. East Pakistan, through the language movement, would ultimately indulge in or take on Mukti Juddha and the emergence of a secular Bangladesh. The history of Bengal, on which I will give another lecture, Qazi Nazrul Islam, includes Qazi Nazrul Islam and many others, Jasimuddin and so on. Qazi Nazrul Islam would have been happy that the Kandari, in his famous poem Kandari Hushiyar, seemed to be doing his job extremely well in the 1950s. Things seem to have changed since then. As I said, I'll give another lecture in Calcutta on Bengali culture and politics next month, but I get the initial list mixed up, IDSK, I've forgotten that that's where it would be, uh, where Achin Chakravarti is located and director. But I should mention quite quickly right now that the West Bengal has fallen behind Bangladesh, of which there seems to be quite a lot of evidence, at least in its success in submerging under the humane force of a combined Bengali identity the narrowly sectarian temptations that paid Rabindranath and Gandhiji so much. Then there is need for some discussion on why and how. If today some people feel fearful and scared, some people with a particular background, to move, scared to move around freely because of their religion or community, then that is a cause enough. That is cause enough for us to ask what has led to this monstrosity being reborn in this proud city of Calcutta. I believe that question is important. Thank you.